Why did a quiet, unassuming general become the man who strangled an entire nation into silence without ever firing another shot? One man, one war, and a silence so thick it choked generations. Books vanished, graves erased, languages outlawed. He didn't just win a war, he erased the future and rewrote the past. Spain didn't just fall, it disappeared behind a curtain of fear and steel. Whispers turned lethal. Eyes on the wrong street could end you. He smiled while history screamed, and somehow, he got away with it. This isn't a story, it's a buried weapon, and now you've found it. The air was still. July 17, 1936. A phone rang in the dark corridors of the Canary Islands military command post, and when Francisco Franco picked it up, Spain began to bleed. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't even loud, just a few words clipped and cold. The voice on the other end didn't shake, neither did Franco's, but the silence between their breaths said everything. The coup had begun, and with it, the slow suffocation of a nation. But Franco had been preparing for this moment his entire life, shaped not by fire, but by ice. He was born in El Farell, Galicia, 1892, a navy town wrapped in Catholic tradition, isolation, and salt. Air, his father drank and womanized, but his mother Pilar Bahamond was rigid, pious, immovable. Franco clung to her like a lifeline. He didn't laugh much. He didn't cry either. Discipline was not taught to him. It was etched into him like a scar. At 13, he entered the infantry academy in Toledo. Short, quiet, almost invisible, but there was something in his eyes, a kind of cold hunger. He didn't shout to be heard. He didn't need to. He learned fast, followed rules like scripture, and waited. Always waited. Then Morocco happened. The Rif War was a butcher's classroom. Soldiers burned alive, heads severed and paraded. Screams echoing across the red sand. Franco didn't flinch. While others vomited or wept, he advanced, calculated, calm, efficient. He rose through the ranks like a shadow in broad daylight, barely seen, but always moving. They called him the Butcher of El Buyuts, but not because he relished blood. He simply didn't fear it. By 1926, at age 33, he was the youngest general in Europe, and yet no parades, no cheers. He wore silence like armor. He believed in Spain, not the fractured one gasping for breath under a weak republic, but in a Spain of order, faith, and obedience. A Spain without noise, without rebellion, without chaos, but chaos was all that was left. The monarchy had collapsed in 1931, swept away by a republic that promised progress and delivered confusion. Priests were dragged through the streets, churches burned, landlords trembled, workers shouted, generals clenched their fists behind closed doors. Spain wasn't just splitting, it was rotting from within. Franco hated noise. The strikes, the speeches, the angry chants in the plazas offended something sacred inside him. In 1934, when the Asturian miners rose up in rebellion, he crushed them with terrifying precision. The government had asked for help. He gave them silence 15,000 troops, artillery, tanks. When the smoke cleared, the rebellion was a graveyard. People watched and whispered. Some feared him, others admired him, but no one truly saw him. He wasn't a loud fascist like Mussolini. He wasn't theatrical. He didn't roar. He stared. As Spain staggered into 1936, it was a powder keg. A leftist coalition had won the elections. Landowners, priests. Franco was sent to the Canary Islands, a quiet exile disguised as a promotion. But silence for him was never surrender. So when the conspirators called in July, he didn't hesitate. No fiery speeches, no hesitation. Just quiet consent followed. By a storm, planes flew from Morocco. Garrisons revolted. And Franco calculating, patient Franco positioned himself like a chess master, watching every move before striking. His role wasn't just military, it was psychological. How silence could scream louder than any gun. But even then, he wasn't the only one vying for power. There were generals with bigger voices, louder ambitions. Franco didn't argue. He waited. Let them shout. Let them boast. Let them burn each other out. By September, the nationalist faction declared him their sole leader. Not because he seized it, because they handed it to him terrified of each other, desperate for unity. And Franco promised order, not hope, not light. Order. Spain split in two. Cities turned into war zones. Brothers shot each other. Mothers buried their sons and forgot how to speak. The Republic fought with fractured fury. Franco fought with terrifying clarity. One Spain must die for the other to live. He wasn't fighting for power. He believed truly that he was saving Spain, but his vision of salvation was absolute obedience. No more debate, no more doubt, only control, only faith, only silence. That silence began to spread like smoke. Books vanished from shelves. Flags were burned. The names of towns were changed. Languages Catalan, Basque were outlawed like crimes. Culture wasn't debated. It was erased. Resistance wasn't argued with. It was buried. And through it all, Franco remained still, cold, composed. The nation screamed. He listened, then made it stop. The war had only just begun. The blood was still fresh, but the soul of Spain, it was already his. A horse stood still. In the ruins of Belchite, its ribcage rising with slow, broken breaths. One eye gone, blood crusted across its flank. Around it, nothing moved. No birds, no wind. Just silence so thick, it rang in the ears like a scream. The year was 1937. Spain had become a grave without names. 3 flags bled into the mud. Gold, black, none offered shelter. In the beginning, it wasn't just war. It was hatred sharpened like a blade. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Priests shot in front of their altars. Teachers dragged through the streets. Farmers buried with their mouths sewn shut. This wasn't politics. It was vengeance dressed as ideology. And in the middle of it all, Franco waited, not with fire. With ice. The Republic held the cities Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia urban hearts, pumping with anarchist fury, socialist hope, and raw panic. The nationalists claimed the countryside vast, slow, hungry. Franco didn't shout like his fellow generals. He took pieces, quietly, ruthlessly. He moved like a surgeon with a scalpel and the eyes of a priest outside Spain. The world didn't blink. It lunged. Hitler sent plain, sleek black death machines with swastikas on their wings. Mussolini sent bombers and soldiers. Stalin countered with tanks and Soviet advisors. The world carved Spain like a corpse on a slab. It wasn't a war anymore. It was a rehearsal for hell. And still, Franco waited, watched. He didn't need to be loud. His silence was strategic. While others played hero or martyr, Franco played God, deciding who lived, who vanished, and who would never be remembered. Then came Guernica. April 26, 1937. A market day. Women buying bread. Children laughing under banners. The first bombs hit without warning. Screams vanished under the roar. Planes dipped low, spitting fire. Mothers tore through the streets with babies clutched to their ribs. But the bombs didn't stop. They circled back. Over and over and over, the earth shook. Flesh burned. Stone melted. When it ended, Guernica didn't exist. It was ash and bone. Franco said nothing. He blamed the victims, called it propaganda. The world gasped, then looked away. Meanwhile, within the nationalist camp, generals whispered. They hated Franco's quiet dominance. He made no grand speeches. He made no mistakes. He consolidated, executed, absorbed. One by one, rivals were silenced through accidents, reassignments, or sudden convenient deaths. By late 1937, Franco wasn't a general. He was the general. And then, something more. Catholico por la gracia de Dios. Leader by the grace of God, not elected, not chosen, anointed. He wrapped himself in Catholicism, cloaking bullets and prayers. Spain was not a republic in his eyes. It was sacred, holy, and it had to be purged. Priests who supported the republic were executed. Churches that had been looted now became fortresses. The cross returned not as mercy, but as judgment, as battles. Raged across the land, the ideological lines burned hotter. Fascism against democracy. No, that's what the world said. But inside Spain, it was faith against heresy. Nation against betrayal. It wasn't about winning. It was about purifying. Cities fell like candles snuffed out in the dark. Malaga, Bilbao, Santander. Each one bled before it died. When Franco took a city, it didn't just surrender, it changed. Streets were renamed, books burned, people vanished into the night, never to be spoken of again. Lists were made, prisons filled, graves swelled, and still Madrid held. The Republic made its stand there. A fight-out pulse of resistance, barricades rose. Loudspeakers cried out hope, even when food ran dry, and the dead lay frozen in the gutters. Franco encircled the city like a snake tightening, starving, choking. Bombs became routine. Hunger became law. People burned furniture for heat and boiled leather to chew. Children were bored underground. Mothers prayed their babies would stay silent, even as shells shattered the sky. By March 1939, it was over. Franco's forces marched into Madrid without resistance. The Republic had torn itself apart from the inside betrayals. Infighting, paranoia, the idealists were either dead or fleeing. The rest surrendered with the numb silence of people who had nothing left. Didn't smile? He didn't need to. Spain was his dot, not through charisma, not through inspiration, through fear, through blood, through absolute, unrelenting control. And when it was over, he stood before the nation, not as a man, but as a monument, cold, untouchable, a Cauthelio by the grace of God. The war had burned Spain to its bones. Now Franco would shape what rose from the ash. Not a republic, not a democracy, not even a kingdom, something older, something darker, something that listened to silence and called it peace. Barefoot, blindfolded, cigarette pressed between his lips. His name wouldn't be recorded. No last words, no mercy, just the echo of boots on gravel and the low rattle of rifles being raised. April 1940. A courtyard in Burgos, cold morning. 6 other bodies already lay face down, leaking into the dirt. Spain was at peace, but it reeked of death. Victory hadn't brought relief, but reckoning Franco called it justice. The others called it La Limpieza cleansing, and it was fast, ruthless, organized like clockwork. Every suspected replicant soldier, poet, teacher, unionist, student was marked. If not for what they'd done, then for what they believed. If not for what they believed, then for what they were. Trials were short, sometimes minutes. Sentences were printed before hearings even started. Some were garroted, strangled slowly with a twisted iron collar. Others shot at dawn, buried without names. Tens of thousands vanished in the first year alone, and no one asked where they went. You didn't ask, the prisons overflowed. Cells meant for 8 held 30. Children were born behind bars. Others were taken from their mothers, given new names, new parents' loyal parents. It wasn't just revenge, it was architecture, a system. Franco was not drunk with power, he was surgical. He didn't want resistance destroyed, he wanted it erased. In 1939, the Ley de Responsabilidades Políticas went into effect. It wasn't a law, it was a verdict passed on millions. If you had voted for the Republic, spoken in its favor, housed a Republican soldier, taught Republican values, you owed a debt to the new Spain. That debt could be your land, your job, your freedom, your child, your life. Franco didn't do this alone, he had a machine. The Phalange, the regime's fist-merged fascist style with Catholic fire, black shirts, rigid salutes, loyalty as sacred law. They controlled the streets, the courts, the airwaves. But another power burned behind, the throne, the church. After years of churches burned and priests murdered by the Republic, the church gave Franco its blessing in full. Pulpits became pulpits of vengeance. Sermons sounded like verdicts. Sin was now political. Faith meant silence, obedience, and fear. Women were reshaped into ghosts. Their rights were stripped like bark from a tree. No vote, no freedom to work, or move, or choose. The section feminine of Franco's women's swing taught girls to sew, clean, obey, suffer. Suffering was holy. Ambition was disease. One guidebook instructed women on how to greet their husbands. Be sweet, be clean, have dinner ready. Don't speak unless spoken to. Girls were married young, forced to birth, forced to kneel, forced to vanish behind lace veils and barred windows. But not even the dictator could starve. Emotion forever. The war in Europe erupted in 1939, and though Spain didn't fire a single shot, it trembled with secret loyalties. Franco loved the Axis. Mussolini had armed him. Hitler's Luftwaffe had tested its bombs on Spanish towns, and yet Franco played the game of silence again, officially non-belligerent, unofficially sympathetic. Blue Division volunteers were quietly sent to fight alongside the Nazis on the Eastern Front. German U-boats refueled in Spanish ports, and in return, Franco was left alone. A ghost dictatorship in a world tearing itself apart. But as 1945 dawned and Hitler's empire collapsed in fire, Franco's smile thinned. The world shifted. The victors looked back at Spain and saw a regime soaked in fascist blood. Sanctions came swift. Embassies closed. Spain was locked out of the United Nations. No Marshall Plan, no recognition, just silence. Cold, economic silence. Red lines stretched. For hours, rats became meat. Black markets ruled the streets. Children passed out in classrooms. Mothers sold heirlooms for rice. They called them Los Ecos, Del Hambre, Years of Hunger, and Franco. He tightened his grip, blamed the enemies of Spain, the foreign devils, the traitors who had already been buried. He didn't loosen control, he doubled it. Books were banned. Radios were censored. Movies imported from the US were cut until only shadows remained. History textbooks showed Franco as a savior. Children raised their arms in salute before reciting their prayers. Whispers returned to the walls. You never said what you thought, not even to your own family, not even in your sleep. Spain wasn't living. It was holding its breath. The prisons still whispered. The mass graves still held their secrets. He had won the silence, and in that silence, he built something far more terrifying than fear. He built normal. The television screen flickered in the dark, its glow the only light in the room. June 3rd, 1970, Franco sat stiff in his chair, silent, one trembling hand resting on the armrest like a fossilized claw. Across the nation, living rooms held their breath. This moment would have been unthinkable. In 1950, Franco's Spain was a coffin with the lid nailed shut, isolated, starving, rotting beneath the weight of its own silence. The world had moved on after the Second World. Franco needed air dots, so he offered Spain's soul in exchange for survival. In 1953, Franco, once a fascist pariah, became an anti-communist shield. Washington looked away from the graves, the garrote, the censorship, the fear, all forgiven for the right enemy. And with that betrayal of ideology came the next one. The country couldn't feed itself. The people couldn't. Wait, Franco didn't change who he was? He changed who he used. He brought in the technocrats, young polished men in suits, members of Opus Dei, priests in all but collar. They spoke in numbers, charts, and plans. They didn't cry over ideology. They counted pesetas. Franco let them run the economy. He held the guns. What followed was something no one had expected, not even him. They called it El Milagro Espagal. Highways paved over forgotten battlefields. Steel plants rose on the bones of villages. Hotels sprang like weeds along the Costa Brava. Spain didn't become free. It became useful. Tourists poured in blonde Germans, leathery Brits, giggling Americans. They brought money. Franco brought them flamenco and bullfights, staged rituals, sanitized for foreign wallets. Sunlight masked the shadows, but those shadows never left. While the beaches danced, the villages remembered. In Catalonia and the Basque Country, voices were still shackled, their languages forbidden, their flags outlawed, their histories erased. In school books, Spain had one face, one tongue, one truth. Everything else was rebellion. But rebellion had a heartbeat. In 1959, it spoke its name, ETA. Born in whispers, raised in exile, fed by rage. Basque nationalists, some barely out of their teens, took two arms. They bombed trains, assassinated officials, planted fear in the cracks of Franco's empire. Franco struck back with fury. Arrests, torture, executions, but ETA didn't shatter. It scattered, regrouped, and came back sharper. Meanwhile, inside Madrid, the regime fed the lie that all was well. Propaganda rolled like waves. Posters, radio shows, school prayers. Franco wasn't just a ruler. He was Spain, eternal, holy, unquestioned. And yet, he was aging the tremor in his hand. But Franco played them all. He wasn't handing power to the phalange. He wasn't handing it to the church. He reached back to monarchy. Back to the dust-covered memory of royal blood and chose Juan Carlos. A boy raised under his gaze, trained in silence, built not to rule but to obey. On paper, it was perfect, but no one trusted it. Not the old guard who saw the monarchy as betrayal, not the underground leftists who saw it as more of the same, and certainly not Franco himself. He didn't crown Juan Carlos. He prepared him, kept him close, then kept him waiting. For years, the Cautelio wouldn't die until the land itself whispered. For it, in the streets, the youth began to change. They wore jeans, listened to foreign bands smuggled on vinyl. They didn't remember the war. They remembered hunger, censorship, fear, but not Franco's war. That was the most dangerous change of all. The fear was thinning. Franco knew it. He tightened harder, arrested more, censored more, held public trials that looked like theater, but ended in execution. But time doesn't flinch. By the early 70s, he was fading. Public appearances were rare. His voice weaker, yet the iron still clenched. It was only in the final years, as his shadow grew longer than his body, that Spain began to look over his shoulder, wondering what would happen after. And he could feel it. The silence that had once obeyed him was now holding its breath for something else. The nurse pulled the sheet over his face at 4:20 a.m. November 20th, 1975, the machine behind him flatlined without drama. No wail, no thunder. Just a soft, steady tone and a silence that Spain had never heard before. Francisco Franco was dead. And for one breathless moment, the country froze, not in mourning, not in relief, in uncertainty. Millions had grown up beneath his shadow, never knowing anything else. Children had learned his name before their own. His face hung in classrooms. His voice echoed from radios like a second gospel. Now that voice was gone, but the silence he left behind, it was louder than ever. That same day, cars moved slowly through Madrid. No music, no horns, no flags, just tight hands on steering wheels and eyes glancing sideways, waiting. In bars they whispered. At dinner tables they changed. The subject, no one knew what came next, but everyone knew what had to be avoided. The past, and that was the beginning of the pact. They called it El Pacto del Olvido, Pact of Forgetting, a handshake made in shadows. Left and right, old fascists and new Democrats agreed on one thing: silence. No trials, no truth commissions, no reckoning. Just forget or pretend to. For the sake of peace, prisoners were freed. Political parties legalized. A constitution was drafted. King Juan Carlos Franco's chosen heir walked the tightrope between reform and rupture. He moved carefully, deliberately, wrapped in suits instead of uniforms. The Spain of the late 70s looked modern on the outside, but beneath it, the scars hadn't faded. They'd just been covered. The 1978 Constitution was hailed as a miracle. It gave birth to democracy, freedom of speech, regional autonomy, rights, laws, voices. It looked like a sunrise, but no one asked about the bodies still buried in unnamed graves. No one asked about the mothers who'd never been told where their sons were shot, or the thousands of children taken from Republican families and re-educated under new names. They were told not to ask. They were told to move on, and for a time, they did. Spain partied through the 1980s, danced with democracy, La Movida in Madrid, punk bands, filmmakers, sexual revolution, color everywhere. It was fast, loud, wild, and underneath it, still quiet, because the past never dies when it's buried alive. The Valley of the Fallen stood untouched, a fascist monument carved into a mountain cross towering high, bones stacked beneath the altar. Franco was buried there, alongside José Antonio Primo de Rivera. Thousands of Republican corpses were transferred there without consent, without names. Families wept outside its gates. Others saluted, and then came the cracks. In the early 2000s, people started digging. Literally, shovels hit bone in dry soil. Mass graves opened like wounds. Eyeglasses, baby shoes, bullet holes in skulls. The past didn't scream, it whispered. Mothers who should have died long ago now pointed at old maps and said, "He's under here." In 2007, the Ley de Memoria Histórica passed. Spain finally acknowledged its ghosts. Grants were offered to help families locate and exhume the missing. Francoist symbols were ordered down from public buildings. But even this act of memory tore Spain in half again. Some called it justice, others called it betrayal. Old wounds split wide open in 2019. Franco's body was removed from the Valley of the Fallen. Helicopter, live broadcast, national debate. He was reburied in a family cemetery, but the silence cracked further. Who has the right to remember? Who decides what counts as truth? Franco's shadow lingers not in statues, but in institutions, in courts shaped by his judges, in police trained under his laws, in a monarchy that traces its legitimacy back to him. Some still call him Cauthelio, others curse him in silence. His name is a Mirawat. It reflects depends on who you were when he ruled. In Catalonia, the wound is raw. Language still fights. For space, memory still battles law. In the Basque country, ETA's legacy hovers like smoke. Decades of blood, torture, assassination. Silence met with silence. Now, Spain is tearing at the seams again, not with rifles, but with words. Parliament chants. Shouted history's flags waved like weapons. One side wants justice, the other calls it revenge. Each step forward feels like trespassing on ground someone else still claims. Children born long after Franco's death are asking dangerous questions. Their grandparents still lower their voices when they answer, because Franco is dead, but silence never needed breath.